All right, so we've got a fascinating case to deep dive into.
Yeah,
The story of Nick Browning,
absolutely.
a seemingly ordinary 15-year-old who was convicted of murdering his entire family.
Right.
And we've got all these sources, police interrogation videos of Nick and his 3 friends,
Yeah.
analyzed by all sorts of experts, you know, law, criminal psychology, clinical psychology.
Uh-huh.
And it's amazing to be able to sort of go back in time
Yeah.
with these sources and be right there in the interrogation room with them as this whole thing unfolds.
It's really powerful stuff.
So let's unpack this case, shall we?
Uh-huh.
What happened that night in Baltimore back in 2008? What led to this horrific crime?
Well, what's so captivating about this case is how it starts. Imagine, February 2nd, 2008, an affluent suburb of Baltimore.
Okay.
Nick Browning and 3 of his friends are coming back from an afternoon at the mall.
Oh, wow.
They pull up to Nick's house expecting, a normal evening.
Oh, great.
And instead they walk into a scene straight out of a horror movie.
Wait, so you're saying they were with him when they found...
Exactly.
Oh, my God.
They were returning from the mall with Nick when his family was murdered.
So he was out with his friends when all this happened?
That's right. And that's what makes this so intriguing right from the beginning. So they go to the house. Initially, it looks like it's been burglarized.
Okay.
But then they find Nick's father,
No.
John Browning,
Mm-hmm.
a prominent attorney, shot dead on the sofa.
Oh, my God.
It's awful. And sadly, it gets worse.
What about the rest of the family? His mom and...
His mother, Tamara, and his 2 younger brothers, 13-year-old Gregory and 11-year-old Benjamin,
Okay.
are all found shot dead in their beds.
God, that's just unimaginable.
Yeah.
I can't even begin to think what must be going through those friends' minds walking into that with him.
And here's where Nick's behavior starts to raise eyebrows, even in those first few moments. You'd expect someone you know in his situation to be completely distraught,
Right.
right? I mean, just discovered your entire family has been murdered.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
But Nick is.
Well, he's unusually calm.
So you're saying he didn't seem to react the way you'd expect?
Exactly. The experts who analyze the footage, they point this out right away.
Okay.
His friends, Ryan, Taylor, and Alex,
Yeah.
they're visibly shaken. They're teenagers. Their reactions are what you'd expect. They're upset. They're crying. They're struggling to even speak.
Mm-hmm.
But Nick, he's composed. He's articulate. He's even casual in his responses to the police.
God, that's chilling. I know everyone processes trauma differently,
Yeah.
but wouldn't you expect, at least some outward sign of grief or shock?
It's definitely a red flag. You got to think about it. In a situation like that, your brain is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. Your fight or flight response kicks in.
Mhm.
It's incredibly difficult to maintain that kind of composure,
Right.
especially for a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
So, this doesn't automatically mean he's guilty,
Right.
but it raises serious questions.
Especially when we think about, the psychology of trauma and how people typically respond to this kind of extreme stress.
So let's get into the interrogation footage then.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's where we really get a glimpse into his behavior and the tactics that the police use to question him. So what can you tell us about the interrogation itself?
Well, the detectives, at the beginning, they take a very friendly approach with all 4 boys.
Okay.
It's all about building rapport, making them feel comfortable.
Mhm.
They ask about their day. They even joke around a bit,
Mm.
offer them snacks and drinks.
That seems pretty standard, right? It's just trying to put the suspect at ease,
Yeah.
encourage them to talk.
Exactly. It's a classic interrogation technique. You kind of lull the suspect into this false sense of security and make them think they're just having a casual conversation.
Okay.
And initially, it seems to work. Nick is chatty. He's talking about school, his golf team, even laughing with the detectives.
So he's really playing along.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing that doesn't last long.
You're right. As the interrogation goes on, the questions start to get more specific,
Yeah.
more pointed. The detectives start probing for inconsistencies,
Uh-huh.
looking for places where Nick's story doesn't match up with what his friends are saying.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for example, Nick initially tells the police that he left his friend Ryan's house around 1:30 a.m. to go get his car.
Okay.
But his friends say it was closer to midnight.
That's a pretty significant difference.
It is.
I imagine the detectives zeroed in on that pretty quickly.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of the car keys.
Right.
Nick claims he fell asleep in his car in the driveway because he couldn't get into the house to get the keys.
Wait, but he was with his friends earlier, right? Wouldn't they have seen him with the keys?
That's the thing.
It doesn't make sense.
It's later revealed that Nick had the car keys in his jacket pocket the whole time.
Oh, wow.
Which, of course, directly contradicts his alibi.
So he's already told a couple pretty big lies.
Yeah.
And the detectives are starting to catch on.
Right.
So what happens next?
Well, this is where the detectives really turn up the heat.
Okay.
They start using much more direct accusatory language, confronting Nick with the fact that his story just doesn't add up. And then comes the bombshell.
Yeah.
They tell him they found the keys to the gun safe under his mattress.
Hold on. Do we actually know if that's true? Or were they bluffing?
That's a great question, and unfortunately we don't know for sure.
Right.
But true or not, it's a powerful tactic.
Right.
It plants that seed of doubt in his mind,
Yeah.
makes him think they have concrete evidence against him.
So how does he react to that? Does he crack under pressure?
His demeanor definitely shifts.
Okay.
He becomes more defensive, less cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
He even starts falling asleep multiple times during the interrogation.
Wait, what? Falling asleep?
Yeah.
That seems like a really unusual response, especially given
yeah.
what's going on.
So
What do the experts make of that?
Well, some suggest it could be a sign of emotional detachment, like a coping mechanism to deal with the stress and the guilt.
Okay.
Others point to his age,
Right.
arguing that, 15-year-old might just be overwhelmed by the situation,
Yeah.
unable to process the enormity of what's happening.
So we have this weird mix of calmness and lying, and then suddenly falling asleep during a murder interrogation. It's all very confusing.
It is.
But the detectives aren't letting up, are they?
Not at all. They keep pushing, using all sorts of interrogation techniques designed to get Nick to break, and eventually he does. He breaks and confesses to shooting his entire family.
Oh, wow. He just comes right out and admits to it.
He does, but here's the thing. He claims it was a result of years of abuse at the hands of his father.
So now we have a whole other layer to this already complex case. I mean, this confession, if it's true, it paints a very different picture of the Browning family dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
What do the experts say about this claim of abuse?
Well, it's crucial to remember that we only have Nick's account of this abuse. We don't have, independent corroboration from other family members or witnesses or anything like that.
Yeah.
However, the experts who analyze the footage, they point out that Nick's emotional state during this part of the interrogation does seem genuine.
Okay.
He's crying, he's struggling to get the words out, he appears truly distraught. It's a stark contrast to his earlier composure.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like the confession itself, shocking as it is, maybe it was a release for him.
Yeah.
A way to finally express all this pain he'd been carrying.
That's certainly one interpretation, but it still leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions.
Of course.
Even if we believe Nick's account of abuse, does it justify his actions?
Yeah.
Can it explain why he would murder his entire family, including his younger brothers?
Yeah, that's what I find so hard to comprehend. What does he say about killing his brothers? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just unthinkable.
His explanation for that is chillingly calculated. He claims he killed them so that there would be no one to contradict his story. Oh, wow.
So that his version of events would be the only one.
It's like he planned the whole thing.
It really points to a very disturbing lack of empathy and remorse. A cold-heartedness that's difficult to reconcile with this image of a terrified, abused teenager.
It's almost like we're dealing with two different people here. The calm, detached Nick from the beginning, and then this emotional, seemingly remorseful Nick confessing to these unspeakable acts. It's mind-boggling.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating from a psychological perspective. Was this a calculated act of revenge? A desperate attempt to escape a horrific situation? Or was Nick suffering from some kind of underlying psychological condition that we just don't know about?
Right.
The experts who analyze this interrogation footage, they offer some possible explanations. But even they admit that it's like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Okay, so let's talk about the interrogation techniques themselves for a second.
Yeah.
Touched on the good cop, bad cop routine earlier. What other methods did the detectives use to try to get him to confess? Well, they used a variety of tactics, many of which are pretty common in these types of interrogations. But it's important to remember that Nick's age and his emotional state make this a really complex case.
Okay.
Because what might be considered standard procedure for an adult suspect could have a very different impact on a 15-year-old.
So what specific techniques are we talking about here?
Well, one of the key tactics they used is called minimizing the circumstances.
Okay.
Essentially, they're downplaying the severity of the crime, suggesting that it was, a mistake, a heat-of-the-moment decision, something that could happen to anyone.
I can see how that might be effective, yeah.
Right.
It's almost like they're giving him permission to admit guilt
Yeah,
without feeling the full weight of it.
exactly. And they reinforce this by offering what are called alternative questions, carefully crafted to lead Nick down a certain path.
Right.
For example, they might say something like, "Are you a cold-blooded killer or someone who just made a terrible mistake?"
Okay, so they're giving him a choice, but both options imply guilt.
Exactly. It's almost like they're scripting the confession for him.
Does this kind of manipulation work on most suspects?
Well, the research on interrogation techniques is complex
Right.
and it's often debated, but there is evidence to suggest that certain tactics, especially when used on vulnerable individuals,
Hmm.
can lead to false confessions.
And that seems like it would apply here.
And in this case, Nick's age, the trauma he just experienced, the sleep deprivation he was likely enduring, I mean, it all makes him particularly susceptible to these kinds of pressures.
It's disturbing to think about. A 15-year-old facing the unimaginable horror of finding his family murdered and then subjected to hours of intense interrogation, sleep-deprived, emotionally vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's no wonder he confessed.
And that's where the ethical considerations come into play. Remember the detectives lied to Nick about finding the gun safe keys under his mattress?
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's a significant breach of trust, and it raises serious questions about the reliability of his confession.
So we had this confession obtained through these questionable means from a teenager who may have been suffering from abuse and psychological trauma. It's hard to know what to make of it all.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so compelling.
Right.
We're forced to grapple with these complexities of the justice system,
Yeah.
the intricacies of human psychology, and these moral gray areas that exist when dealing with a case like this.
Okay, so Nick confesses, but what happens next? Does the case go to trial?
Yes, the case goes to trial, and Nick, despite his age and the circumstances surrounding his confession, is ultimately convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder.
Wow, 4 counts of first-degree murder. That's a heavy sentence, especially for someone so young.
It is, and what's particularly thought-provoking is that even after Nick was convicted, even after he led the police to the murder weapon, his family, his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, they pleaded for leniency.
So they believed in his innocence.
Not necessarily. They acknowledged the horrific nature of his crimes.
Okay.
But they painted this picture of Nick as a victim of abuse, a troubled kid who needed help, not punishment.
Uh-huh.
They wrote letters to the court. They asked for a lighter sentence. They emphasized his age, the trauma he'd endured.
That adds another layer of complexity to this already intricate case.
It
It
does.
forces us to consider the possibility that maybe there's more to the story than we know. That maybe Nick wasn't just a cold-blooded killer.
Yeah, maybe there were deeper psychological issues at play. Maybe the abuse he suffered played a bigger role than we can fully comprehend.
Of course, none of that excuses his actions.
Of course.
I mean, he still took the lives of 4 innocent people, including his own mother and brothers.
No, absolutely. But it does raise important questions about how we understand and address cases involving young offenders,
Right.
especially when there are allegations of abuse and potential mental health issues.
It's a reminder that the justice system, while striving for fairness and accountability, sometimes has to grapple with these messy realities of human behavior,
Yeah.
these blurred lines between victim and perpetrator.
Precisely. And that's what makes the Nick Browning case so thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It's not just a crime story, it's a human story.
Right.
A story that defies easy answers
Mhm.
and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
It feels like we're left with more questions than answers, even after going through the interrogation, the trial, and hearing about the reactions of Nick's extended family.
Yeah, and that's often the case, right? We analyze the evidence, we try to understand the psychology, but human behavior can be so elusive.
Yeah.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where you might not even have all the pieces.
Right. Like, what drove Nick to commit such a horrific act? Was it just the alleged abuse, or was there something else going on that we haven't even considered?
And that brings us back to his personality, to the possibility of underlying psychological issues. The experts who analyzed the footage, they pointed out some traits and behaviors in Nick that they think warrant further exploration.
Like what?
Well, for instance, they noticed a remarkable lack of empathy from Nick throughout the entire process.
You mean like not just for his victims, but...
Not just for his victims, but for his friends, too. The ones who were clearly traumatized by the whole thing.
Yeah.
He just doesn't seem to connect with their pain at all.
So it's not just the initial shock of finding his family.
Right.
It goes deeper than that.
It seems that way. And this lack of empathy,
Mm.
combined with his manipulative tendencies and that chillingly calculated explanation for killing his brothers, well, it raises concerns about potential signs of antisocial personality disorder.
Antisocial personality disorder. Are you saying he might have a serious mental health condition?
It's a possibility worth considering.
Okay.
Now, of course, we can't diagnose anyone based just on interrogation footage,
Right.
but the experts, they raise this point as something that should have been investigated further.
Especially considering his age.
Exactly, because if he was struggling with a serious mental health issue,
Yeah.
wouldn't that have impacted his actions, his ability to control his impulses,
Right. His understanding of,
his understanding of right and wrong?
yeah.
It all comes into play.
It's almost like we're dealing with two different issues.
Yeah.
The crime itself, and then this potential underlying condition.
That's the challenge, isn't it? How do we balance the need for justice with the need for understanding, for recognizing that even in the most horrific cases, mental health can play a huge role?
It's a tough thing to think about, and
Yeah.
it definitely makes this case more complex than just a simple whodunit.
Absolutely. The Nick Browning case forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths
Yeah.
about the limits of our legal system, about how complicated human psychology is, and about all the gray areas that exist when we're dealing with crimes like this.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listener? What do we want them to think about?
Well, I think first and foremost, just how complex this case really is.
Right.
It's easy to jump to conclusions to say Nick's a monster and be done with it,
Yeah.
but it's just not that simple. We've seen how the interrogation process itself can be full of ethical dilemmas. We've seen how psychological manipulation can lead to confessions that might not be reliable.
About mental health issues.
Especially in young offenders,
Yeah.
they can play such a significant role in these crimes. The Nick Browning case, it reminds us that justice is important, but so is understanding. We need a system that doesn't just punish people, but tries to get at the root causes of these crimes,
Right.
to understand how individual psychology and societal factors all come together.
It's a lot to process. In this case, it definitely leaves me feeling uneasy in a way, knowing that sometimes these really disturbing crimes just don't have easy answers.
I think that's maybe the most important thing to learn here.
Yeah.
We have to approach these cases with humility, with a willingness to question what we think we know, and to recognize that sometimes we just don't understand the full story.
That's very true.
The Nick Browning case isn't just about a crime. It's a story about all of us, about how fragile the human mind can be, how complex our legal system is, and how mysterious human behavior really is.
It's been a really thought-provoking deep dive, and I think this case will definitely stick with people.
I think so, too.